In 1933, a massacre in northern Iraq killed thousands of people belonging to the indigenous Assyrian community. This history was largely forgotten outside of Assyrian circles, but 90 years later, the world is just starting to recognize this tragedy. The story begins many years earlier in 1914. Assyrians had joined the British as an ally in World War I. In return for their fighting to protect British interests in the Middle East, Assyrians were promised an autonomous region. But following the Great War and the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations declined the Assyrian petition. These Assyrian communities were instead divided between parts of modern-day Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. This didn't stop Assyrians from continuing to fight for autonomy in the Duhok region just north of Mosul. The Iraqi state rejected these demands, worried this would harm their own nationalist movement and encourage other ethnic groups like the Kurds to do the same. During the time, Britain was governing the Kingdom of Iraq through a mandate. But by 1932, Iraq was granted full independence. This caused considerable unease among Assyrians, as Iraqi nationals had been calling for quiet to the growing calls for Assyrian autonomy. In documents uncovered decades later, it was revealed that British officers received reports that violence against Assyrians would follow from their withdrawal from the country. But the officers ignored these reports and instead assured Assyrian community leaders their people would be safe. Many Assyrians are later said to have felt betrayed by the British, at first used to protect British interests, and later left for dead when British forces abruptly left the country and disregarded these notices of violence. And it didn't take long once the British left for Iraqi calls of attacks against their indigenous neighbors. Iraqi authorities began campaigns to smear Assyrians. Newspapers and radio stations ran anti-Assyrian editorials and notices for Assyrians to be disarmed and not to be settled in the same area.
One of the scariest things for these new nations was that these people seemed to have a powerful connection to this land, to this territory, and it could be easily proven. And so what is the only way in which they could shift that focus or could argue that that is not the case? Well, either they deny these people their identity, at the same time physically forcing them to be a non-entity in those lands.
In July 1933, Assyrian leaders met with British advisors and representatives of the Iraqi government. They were ordered to surrender their arms and move to government-controlled areas or leave the country. Some leaders agreed to turn over their weapons and leave the country for Syria, but others refused. Orders were handed down to the Iraqi army and local armed tribes to prepare to disband Assyrian communities in the country's north. Assyrians were attacked by Iraqi-aligned forces in the Duhok district in northern Iraq. Government forces then rounded up and transferred civilians from these areas to the village of Samail under the promise they would be protected. But Iraqi forces soon began killing the men using field executions, according to newspaper reports at the time, and many young women were raped and made to march naked before Iraqi commanders. In total, at least 63 Assyrian villages in modern-day Duhok and Mosul were attacked by the Iraqi army, and an estimated 3,500 Assyrians were killed in Samail and buried in mass graves.
One of the most devastating effects of this Anglo-Iraqi agreement was that many of the bombs that were dropped on Assyrians in the region of Samail, so not just the town of Samail, but the region, many of those bombs were actually British bombs that were given. These were British weapons that were given to the Iraqis, which were then used against the Assyrians. And many British officers were very hurt by it, but most of the higher-ranking officers sort of quelled that very quickly to say that we don't really have any way to fix this particular issue for the Assyrians. We have this larger issue, which is the Anglo-Iraqi agreement. Betrayal is a very apt word for most Assyrians.
Upon the National Army's return to Baghdad, they were greeted with cheers and celebrated in the streets of the capital. Assyrian leaders petitioned the British and League of Nations to investigate the slaughter and protect any remaining Assyrians that lived in the country. But the British, careful not to upset the new kingdom of Iraq, instead expelled about 10,000 Assyrians from the country and resettled them in the Haba region of Syria. And while much of the world has forgotten about this massacre, each year Assyrians remember Samail on August 7th, known as Assyrian Martyrs' Day.
By 1933, there was no place for Assyrians to fit in, at least I think from the Assyrian perspective, especially if you saw that sense of jubilation for putting down this coup. And if you knew it was enough to be Assyrian to be shot, then what was the way in which people survived? in many cases, they simply stopped being Assyrian. The events of Sumail in 1933 are a true watershed moment for the fragmentation of the Assyrian people.